Fred Ferrer has over 3 decades of leadership in mobilizing stakeholders and staff toward change through groundbreaking nonprofit and public policy initiatives, programs, and system reforms. He is the former executive director of Estrella Family Services and was chair of First Five Santa Clara County Commission. He is the chair of Santa Clara University's College of Arts and Sciences Leadership Advisory Board, and he chaired the university's Blue Ribbon Commission on Diversity and Inclusion. He is the former chair of Rocketship Public Schools and is also a member of the Children's Discovery Museum. And I do encourage you all to please visit his bio on, I'm actually going to put it, if it's not already in the chat, I'm going to put it here because Fred just has so many titles and so many awards and so much accolade. And we're going to dig in a little bit into that because it's really, when you read between the lines of Fred's bio and you read between the lines of these awards and these titles, you really start to understand the immense and deep and grassroots impact Fred's leadership, Fred's friendship, Fred's mentorship, and Fred's commitment to service has had on this valley for generations, and the impact of generations to come because of that service. So, oh, great! It's put there in the chat. So, Fred, I'd like to start with speaking of you heard Jessica and so many of us speak about how you have not only shown up in leadership at your own nonprofits that you have run or been a part of, but how you really have helped other people in their leadership in their nonprofits in various spaces. Can you talk a little bit about, and I know personally as an executive director, the way you have shown up for me in the nonprofit space, can you talk a little bit about what you are really known for, and that is mentoring others in these sectors? And can you talk about why that is something that you do and how you have done that for others in the community?
Yeah, I think, Darcy, that for me, the frame I use is kind of like too much is given, much is expected. I grew up in a community and a family that I think really just instilled the acts of service. I went to school in Catholic schools, and that's all we learned about. And when I went to Santa Clara, the Jesuits talking about being a person for others just always made sense to me, and it was always part of kind of the framework of my family or the community that I lived in. So becoming an exec at when I was 28 years old, that was the first time I became executive director at a nonprofit. It's called Gardner Children's Center, Gardner Children's Center, Gardner Health Center, Gardner School, Gardner Community Center, and the Gardner District. Was part of Model Cities. I taught Head Start, which is the war on poverty. It came from that era of activism to try to figure out how do we upgrade and lift communities. And I grew up in Marin County, and so had a very privileged childhood and education. And when I came down here to go to Santa Clara, I really wanted to continue that kind of piece of service, and so used the privilege that I had, my education and my background and the resources in my family, to be able to say, I really want to do something. I want to make a difference. And so having that kind of spirit of like collaborative effort, like how do you do this together, I think has always just been kind of in my DNA. In early childhood education in Santa Clara County, we always were very collaborative because it was kind of us against the world. And in early childhood, because we were funded by the state, we really weren't locally funded, and we really didn't have local connections. So we really were much more state focused. And so therefore, my real colleagues that I worked really closely with, especially early in my career, were colleagues that were running State Department of Ed programs throughout the state and not necessarily even in Santa Clara County. That came as part of it. But I think the spirit in early childhood of cooperation and collaboration just is a strong kind of cultural tradition in ECE. And in child development, that's just what we do. So I do think that kind of started the frame of like, how do you partner with others and not just try to do this on your own? I think the other thing I would say is that I really focus on the family, and in my case, brown families and low-income families. I've never worked with high-income families in my career, and I'm really okay with that. But in working with families in the community, I'm really influenced by, I was a Head Start teacher, and Head Start's War on Poverty through the Johnson administration was really focused on how do you give a family a head start was an economic model. It wasn't just an education model. So I've always kind of looked at things of like, how do we raise families out of poverty, as opposed to how do we just make sure that their kid is educated? Because without the two going hand in hand, we talk about children learning, but parents earning. Like if those two don't go together, it never made sense to me. So for me, it's just the spirit of like, if you really are serious about the mission, in my case, little kids, then you can't do this alone if you're smart. And therefore, how do you find like-minded folks to be able to work with? And then once you have that, how do you give that back? Because there was many people that were very supportive to me early in my career. And so therefore, how do I give that back now? Especially if I want to continue serving the mission of how do we make this community a better place?
I think I've been in rooms where I've actually heard you say those words. How do we get this done, and how do we do it together? I'm sure I'm positive I've heard you say that many times. And I know for a fact you have said it to me individually about the work we do at Latinos Contra Cancer. I've heard you once talk about a story where someone said that they were surprised to know you weren't from East San Jose, or surprised to know you didn't come from many of the communities that you spend so much time serving so authentically. Can you speak a little bit to that balancing of the privileges that you had growing up, and in the context of how boldly and authentically you show up for communities that don't have the same privilege?
Yeah, I was 25, I think, when I was teaching Head Start, and being a male in early childhood was not typical, obviously. And so I worked for the County Office of Education, the Head Start program, and they sent me to San Martin. And I taught at St. Catherine's Church in San Martin, had a Head Start. And it was a terrible commute. And it was just like the worst kind of things that you could do. The community was amazing. I loved the San Martin community and St. Catherine's Church, but it was a real hassle of an assignment. And so I asked for transfer, and I said I would go anywhere on the East Side. And they're like, are you sure? And because there was a lot of violence on the East Side, and folks were really not comfortable going. We had closed some of our Head Start programs because of the violence in the community, and our teachers didn't feel safe. And they're like, well, we'd love to send you to, then, if you really are serious, we would send you to Foxdale Apartments, which is the housing urban development project. And back there, a pretty shaky kind of place. And if you go as a male teacher, we'll send another teacher. We'll actually open 2 classrooms there if you'll go. And I'm like, I'll go. And so went to Foxdale and was there for a few years. And that center still exists. And the violence of that place was there, especially at night. And so for me, when you work with their children and you know the family, the violence piece doesn't really have the same effect, if you will. So for me, it was always like, yeah, but that's so-and-so's mother, or that's so-and-so's uncle. And we knew that drugs and alcohol and violence and guns, and like, it was not something that we were like, didn't understand. But if we're going to do something, you have to be a part of. You can't just come from the outside and feel like you're going to make any difference. So I had a great experience with, families, and especially with young parents with young kids. And I was a young teacher, so I didn't know better than to think that, wow, you could really do a whole bunch of stuff. Now, I learned that the system doesn't always think that's a great idea, but for me, that kind of early commitment to people in the real community. And then from there, I went to Gardner Children's Center, which we changed later to Estrella Family Services. And in the Gardner district, that's one of the most beautiful places in our community. And Gardner, Alma, Washington has a very interesting history with the original Chilean immigration when Pinochet overthrew the government in Chile, and Barrio Horseshoe and the different gangs on the different sides of the bridge. And I mean, it has the Italians immigrated there, turn of the century. Some of you know the Italian Gardens restaurant because they were the Italian Gardens. And so for me, being in a community where you can see people that you come to know, I was at Gardner Estrella Family Services for 19 years. Absolutely loved being in the community, knowing the neighbors, knowing the kids. We had programs from infancy through 5th grade, so I could be with families and really help raise kids. Some of those kids actually work for nonprofits today. They're in their 30 somethings, but which was awesome just to be able to understand who they are and what they're doing. Many of them went to college, many of them, which was absolutely unheard of back then. So loved being in community and being part of, and never really understood this kind of distinction of how do you do things to folks? If you're not with folks, it's not going to work. So yeah, when one of my staff at Health Trust once said, well, when you were, growing up at the East Side, and I said, I did not grow up in the East Side. I didn't even grow up the East Side of San Rafael, right? I grew up in the West Side of San Rafael. She's like, you're kidding. And I'm like, no. And it was a real compliment to me because it does say like, yes, you can be part of when you're not from there necessarily, if you are in solidarity with the community of people that you're working with.
So, and this is such an important topic because I've been in many coalition spaces and Zoom rooms where you have also been present, and you're that person to continue to surface the restorative aspects of holding space for people to be in, to do the work, to be in authentic solidarity with people they may not share lived experience with. And I think at this time, when we're all trying to figure out as a Valley how to build power together, how to overcome racism, how to topple white supremacist systems, and we're trying to do this really, really hard work with people with trying to center people with lived experience at the forefront, while also being people with different proximities to power and privilege. And I often hear you in these spaces talk about this idea of like, you just can't, some people do need to be like put to the side and maybe do their work before they can return. But this idea that you bring up often is like, how do we call people in? And in what ways do you think your background and the privileges that you had growing up, yet still having the ability to be in authentic solidarity with the folks you serve, how does that influence the way you show up in these spaces when we're, especially now and these times of like the politics and social unrest where we're at, where it is really difficult, I think, to call people in when there's so much attack on just like human dignity and human rights, and the issues are so urgent. How do people balance that, knowing that you can, as you said, be in authentic solidarity? What kind of work needs to happen, and what do we as a community do to hold space for that?
Yeah, I guess for me, my experience is like, I was talking to Darcy the other day, we were talking about this. I'm like, I'm the only gay Latino head of a nonprofit in our county. You'd say, okay, well, and early childhood. So I'm a really weird one, right? So if you think about it, therefore, like, how is that different, right? So for me, growing up as a Latino in a white community, there you have that challenge of not fitting in there. And then I come down here and I'm not really, when I went to Santa Clara, it was a bizarre time. Giselle talked about it, and I was way before Giselle. And it's that kind of like, they were tokenisms. It was just a really different kind of bizarre politics during that time when I was at Santa Clara. So kind of you never fit in no matter where you were. And then as a Latino gay, that's a whole other challenge, because think about it, your country, your family, your church, none of them approve of you. And so you learn like, okay, I'm not okay from these pretty powerful institutions in your life. And yet, so how do you survive? How do you thrive, much less coming out of that? And so for me, I don't look at it as I'm that different than many people in the community, because I know what it's like to be on the outside looking in. I know what it's like to have the microaggression and the direct aggressions. The Supreme Court's going to overthrow my right to get married. Like, that's kind of an interesting perspective, right? And so there's not this kind of like, oh, I don't know those things. Now, I remember parents coming to pick up their kids in 1988 that were high as a kite on meth. Back then, it was a different version of it. Now, do I condemn that parent forever, right? What do I do? So in my mind, restorative justice, the notion of how do we aren't all we're not the only person on the worst day of our lives. There's much more to us. To me, it's so much easier to just dismiss folks, kick them out, expel them, fire them, do whatever, because they don't mix up. Now, accountability is a different issue for me. But restorative issues for me, especially because I come from a background working with kids, like if we kick every kid out of school, I've never understood expulsion, right? There's no theory you can explain to me that says that's a great idea, right? Yes, kids have that place, but in my mind, the kid is acting out in a way that's talking to us, right? Restorative justice pushes us to challenge us to think about, okay, what if you can't kick them out? What do you do? And, there's lots of accountability and tough love, and there's all kinds of notions around it. But my spirit really is about how do I really think through restorative notions of calling in. It is much easier, much more facile, politically expedient just to kick something out. But you didn't really eliminate the issue, and you still haven't talked about the issue. So we can talk about anti-racism and anti-Black and all these things, and you could kick out everybody out of the conversation that doesn't agree with you. You did not do one thing to change anti-race issues that are going on. And I guess growing up as a gay kid and as a gay young man and trying to figure this out in the world, like if I was kicked out of everything because I was gay, I would not be an American citizen. I would not be a Catholic. I would not be like, think about it. I would have been kicked out of so many different places. And I just think that power shift is something that we've got to think through differently if we're going to be more effective in the long run. And it's not the gift I want kids to learn of like, well, you are right and everything else is wrong. And when they're wrong, you just eliminate it. Like that is the world that we're getting to. And it's just not a world that I think is healthy.
I want to circle back to and so you may not know this, but Fred founded a fellowship at Latinos contra Cancer, the Ferrer Health Justice Fellowship. This is our second year of it. We had 4 health justice fellows last year, Latinas who were on either med tracks or going to be doctors, public health leaders. And this year we have 8. And I had the opportunity to hear Fred speak. We have a monthly speaker series for them with Latino leaders, and he was their first speaker. And so I had the opportunity to hear Fred talk about what it was like to be gay during the AIDS epidemic and during the political unrest, and to be an activist too. I think we know Fred as a nonprofit advocate and a leader, an academic, and Fred's also an activist. And can you talk a little bit about your activism in that space and just what you experienced and went through?
Yeah, I mean, I graduated from Santa Clara in 1980. And so I'll be 65 in December. And so I really was part of that era where, right in the heart of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, was really my kind of part of my era. So one of my best friends in high school was probably my best friend in high school. He went to Stanford, I went to Santa Clara, but we still stayed really good friends. And then after that, we got even closer. And he traveled the world and did all kinds of things. He was a really talented young person. And he was the first person I knew personally, my closest friends, who became HIV positive. He lived quite long for that time. He lived about 10 years before dying. But understanding like the ravaging nature of HIV, remember I grew up in Marin, but San Francisco was super close. And then from here, San Francisco was just as close because San Francisco was really the community where you went when you were gay. So my Santa Clara classmates, for example, undercover went to San Francisco. So many of my classmates from Santa Clara have died of HIV related illnesses, my high school friends. So it's not something that you can be an activist with unless it came to me because of these personal lives folks that I buried. And for me, you have kind of like 2 paths. One, you can go into denial and anger and depression, or you can try to do something about it. And so activism in my mind came from that spirit of like, not only my family, but also really my experiences during the AIDS crisis. Years later, when I was at the Health Trust and we had our AIDS services department and the largest one in the community, there was a lot of folks were like, and to this day, I hear this all the time, like, oh, why are we still doing that? Why isn't just, why don't we eliminate this? Why don't we eliminate those kinds of things? And when you look at who has HIV today, it's brown and Black people in our community, right? It's not gay, white, gay white men who got a lot of money. That's not really who has HIV in our community anymore. And most of the people that have HIV is undetected. They don't know. And so to me, this is just another example of like how if you're not an activist on an issue, it's gonna just, it's not gonna get better on its own. And so understanding the kind of personal commitment to something like HIV really then became part of what I had to think through of like, how do I respond? And so part of it is to deal with your own grief and hospice care and volunteering with others and being there. I have had way too many people in my life die. My parents, my grandparents, my godparents, my brother-in-law. I mean, I have had a lot of friends, my Head Start friends. A lot of folks have died in my life, and HIV was just a big chunk of it at one time. But it was an entire community that had to go through that. And that to me is kind of a birthplace of, as I say, what do you do with that personal grief? What I chose to do is really become much more of an activist. And when I was at the Health Trust, I think that the work that I did on HIV was another extension of, and really a dedication to those people that died that were so close to me.
You and I, in our conversation we had even just this week, you had talked about knowing that in many of the spaces you've been in, knowing that in many of them you were different, right? And so that might bring you to think differently because of the reasons you've just mentioned, and being either maybe outwardly different or internally different in many of these spaces. And I have witnessed you show up in so many spaces very, very boldly, very matter of factly, very, like come on, people, like we need to, how are we doing this and how are we doing this together? And you've always been at the forefront of so many really important issues, whether it was, fluoride or, student choice and innovation in schools or disrupting different systems. You haven't been, you seemingly have been unafraid to speak truth to power in many different spaces. I'm wondering how, clearly these different experiences you've had over your life have maybe led you to various points where the urgency of like what's going on around you. And I'm wondering, many might look at it as courage, but is it even courage, right? Does it even feel like courage, or at this point, is it just you?
Yeah. When we were talking the other day, I was like a really interesting kind of frame, because I don't really frame it that way. I frame it much more in terms of like what needs to get done on behalf of the kid, right? I always go back to. And so fluoride was a great example. There are anti-fluoride people. You think the anti-vaxxer people are whack? The anti-fluoride people are 10 times crazier. And so I learned a ton about how do you get this done, because the brown kids on the east side of San Jose don't have fluoride, and the white kids in Palo Alto do. Like, this is before race became the big issue, right? I'm like, this is not the new thing. It's just that we can be more comfortable in policy, whether that be public health policy or child welfare policy, when you can just make it about money or about political will, like all those kinds of what I call institutional racist excuses, right? So fluoride was a really good example. I'll go back to Head Start. I was fluoridating kids' teeth, doing the spit, rinse and spit, in 1989. So it wasn't like, oh, I had no idea how to do this. And Marty Fensterscheib, another gay leader, who was a pediatrician, and I were like, this is no brainer to us in terms of what is the right thing to do. Now, you got to be either really stupid if you think you're going to do it just because it's the right thing to do. You have to understand the political strategy, the media connection, all of the different things you have to do. You have to have smartness to be able to figure out how do you get this done. San Jose was the largest city in the country without community fluoridation, community water fluoridation. It is no longer that. We never went to an initiative with on the ballot, just like Portland did, and Portland lost. We connected all the dots and got it done without having to bring off the whole nation here to fix it and to fight us. Nora was part of that fight, others, but that's a good example of where you could get smarter than trying to be right in public. And so for me, things like the disruptive innovation stuff I brought from Harvard and the late Professor Christensen really was trying to figure out what are the new ways of thinking about this, because people are still suffering. right? There was still the challenge that we weren't dealing with. The schools were terrible. I have a lot more experience in the schools and public schools than I ever wanted to, but I did not believe that our kids, like at Gardner and Estrella and all the different kids places and on the east side, that the schools were meeting their needs to be okay. And schools to me don't have this high expectation that I expect that I would have for my own kid. And so when John Porter said to me that he was excited that kids in Franklin McKinley had gone from, 35% on grade level to 45%, I looked at him and I said, John, you're telling me that you're excited that the majority of your kids are still not on grade level. Like that is that is just an absolute path to poverty. And as a public health person, I'm like, it's also going to be a shorter lifespan. You're going to get more chronic conditions. There's a million different challenges, but you could get comfortable like, oh, we made this progress. Well, it's great, but it's not enough if you really are going to deal with the bigger challenge. So pushing charter schools, which is the most unpopular thing you can do in Santa Clara County, all my good Democratic labor friends and supporters, like Don Roach was visiting a rocket ship school because it was in his district. And he came up to me on the side and was like, what the hell are you doing here? And I said, I want you to see. Like, I can tell you what I'm doing here. And anybody can argue with me about the product that we're putting out at Rocket Ship. I take on that argument any day. And when I was at the 15-year anniversary last week, and watching kids that are in law school today, I'm like, yes, that's what I expected. That was my goal. So yeah, I guess there's some courage to it. It is not a popular fight. It's not something that you should do for popularity. And I think if I maintain my integrity around this to say, I can argue for why it's important and why it's right, from an academic, from a research, from the evidence, and from the record of what we've done that's failed, then that's how I'm going to push forward on this issue. And if the politics are there or not there, I'm sorry, but my North Star is not the politics. And so that's why I am never going to have Jessica's challenge with her husband. I am never going to be an elected official because I couldn't do the compromising strategizing that folks like Nora and others have been masterful at doing. I just don't do that. And it gets you in trouble. I pushed our board at the Health Trust to be the first $1 million investor in Educare. Like, we stood up, that because I understood the importance of what was possible in early childhood. And Packard and others followed. I was the first $1 million to measure A around homelessness and housing. That probably cost me my job at the Health Trust, quite frankly, because the white power to be was like, you really can't do those things. And I feel like sometimes, like the loss that I took, and any time in my career, whenever there was that loss, I slept fine that night, right? Because I knew that in my heart of hearts and in my commitment, there was never a doubt of what we should do and what was the right thing to do. Maybe the politically smarter thing would have been to do something else, but I knew exactly what would happen if we pushed forward in certain ways. And Measure A passed by freaking 3 people probably, and yet there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are in housing today that wouldn't have existed had I not pushed our board to get to that place.
I have a closing question, but I'm going to open it up to folks who have questions here before we do the closing question, which is going to be a little bit of a call to action, I think.